This picture, this image that I'm showing, it caught my attention as I was looking for different images for the sermon this week. And I thought about this idea, and we often talk about our life being like a journey. There's a journey in front of all of us. We don't know how much longer our journey will last. It might last a year, it might last decades, we don't know. And we don't know what's next in our journey, but we are all on a journey. Sometimes the journey that we're on, it has sunny days. You got an A on your midterm, or the professor said you don't have to write the paper, or job worked out well. There are sunny days maybe. But the journey also has occasions when it rains. And sometimes it downpours. At times it seems life-threatening. And so through sunshine and through rain, there is always something next that's coming in our life. No matter how old you get, there's something next that's coming. When you graduate elementary school, there's middle school, junior high. When you graduate junior high, there's high school, college, marriage, children, death of our parents, different things, cancer. There are so many things that we face, all of us in different ways. We all have different journeys, but the commonality is that there's always something next that we are getting ready for. I think about my own journey. I think about the journeys of other people I know. And I don't think there's ever a time when we are not somehow needing to get ready for what's coming next. Even if you come out of something and even if you finish something, there's something that's coming that you got to get ready for. And so we must always be getting ready for what is next in our life. What is next in your journey right now? Think ahead. Think tomorrow. Think next year. What is ahead for you? Something is always next. Maybe it's a job thing that's next. Maybe it's a relationship thing that's next. Maybe a family thing that's next. Maybe an overcoming sin thing that's next. Maybe a lifestyle change thing that's next. Maybe a decision to be made that's next. But in different ways, we are all getting ready for what is coming next. So as we think about today's passage, we find the Israelites here, they too are getting ready for what's next. Next week in chapter 6, the Israelites are going to face the first city, the fortified city of Jericho, that they need to overcome to take the promised land. It's God's promised land to them, but there's all these inhabitants living there. And they consider it their home, and they're not ready to give it up to Israel. So Israel is going to have to go and overtake that city. But they just celebrated, and they just crossed the Jordan. They just memorialized it. They built an altar. They had a miracle. They're celebrating, but now there's something that's coming next. So even when we cross Jordan rivers in our life, there's always a Jericho that's waiting for us. There's always a Jericho coming. Thank God that there are many Jordan rivers that we've crossed, but there's always a Jericho that's coming. So today we want to learn from these Israelites and we'll learn from what God is doing as we think about what's coming next in our life. So we've been going through the book of Joshua. We've gone through Joshua chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4 over the past month. Now, today we're going to look at three things from this passage. First of all, renewal of the covenant so that we can get ready for what's coming next. Reliance on the provision. And then third, readiness for the battle. We'll talk about these three things this morning. So first of all, let's talk about renewal of the covenant. Look at verse 2. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time." Every Sunday night we have this little family worship with the kids, and I usually just talk about the passage that we studied at church. Oh boy, tonight when I read this one, I'm going to have a lot of explaining to do. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Harloth. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the males of the people who came out of Egypt, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. So from the perspective of Israel, it is the perfect time to charge forward, attack, and to conquer the rest of the land that God has promised them. I mean, they had miraculously crossed the Jordan. They had followed the Ark of the Covenant into the water. The water moved away, and they crossed over on dry ground. They just built an altar, remembering and worshiping God. God was doing his thing. They were on a winning streak. They had momentum as a nation. They were on fire. Isn't it time now for them to go forth and take the land that God has promised to them and to their forefathers? But instead of doing what makes logical sense, God instead has them do the illogical. Instead of sending them into the battle, what does he do? He slows them down to be circumcised. Now, verse 2 tells us that this was done with flint knives. I don't really know what a flint knife is, so I looked it up a little bit. And I found that, think about these Israelites. This is not a sterile hospital environment they're going to. All the men, come on, we're going to the hospital. Anesthesia, this is not that. This is out in the field, out in the open. And supposedly a flint knife might have looked something like this. Now just let that sink in for a little while. Think about that. It does not make sense here. Now, you've entered the enemy territory. They should have done this on the other side of the Jordan before they went into the enemy territory. But you're doing this illogical thing, performing a painful surgical procedure on all of the men. Now, all of the men. It's going to leave them completely vulnerable, unable to defend themselves against the enemy that's going to come and attack them possibly because they've just entered their land. Now, I don't know if there were some designated people who went around circumcising. I don't know if they paired up and circumcised one another. I don't know, maybe they circumcised themselves. All I know is it must have been bloody, painful, and left all the men of the nation unable to do anything because they're laying down, recovering. Someone comes, attacks them, they can't get up. Can you imagine this vulnerable situation that God puts them in? I think about why. We need to reflect on why does God do this? Why does God do this now, having them be circumcised when they should be charging into battle to take the land? Well, if we think a little bit, we go back to Genesis 17, we can remember that Abraham, the father of Israel, and his sons were circumcised as a sign of the covenant that God made with them. So circumcision, of course, is cutting off of the male foreskin and separating that, cutting that away. And what it does, it symbolizes cutting off of sin from our life, cutting that away, removal of sin from our life. That's what that physical act symbolizes spiritually. So for Abraham, circumcision, doing that procedure, did not make him righteous before God. It wasn't about doing that, but doing that symbolized his righteousness because of faith. So circumcision was an outward sign of an inward reality, the faith that exists in his heart, and it's that faith by which he was counted and declared righteous. Apostle Paul in Romans, he talks about this. Romans chapter 4, he says, talking about Abraham, he says, Abraham, received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised. So it's not about the circumcision itself, but it's a sign of that covenant so that righteousness will be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised who are not merely circumcised, but also who walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Again, the idea of physical circumcision was that it symbolized a circumcision of our hearts. Sin, nature of sin is separated from us, removed from us, circumcision of our hearts is what this circumcision symbolizes. So what God is having them do here is renew the covenant that they would be God's people and God would be their God. It's a renewal of their vows. So why does God have them be circumcised, even though it leaves them illogical? It's illogical and leaves them completely vulnerable? Because more than the right military strategy, they needed a right relationship with God. You see, their parents, they were not able to enter the promised land because they rebelled against God. But this generation must recommit their hearts to God. So this circumcision is about God and Israel renewing their vows to one another before taking the land. The Israelites were militarily ready, but not spiritually ready. Again, more than strategy, God was concerned about the state of their hearts. Oftentimes we think we're ready. We're ready for something. We're ready for the next stage, the next step of our life. But God knows the condition of our hearts, and we may not always be ready in His eyes. I think there's a good application here. God is always most concerned with the state of our hearts. Many of us, we might be good at strategically planning as we think about the next few years of our life. We're good at thinking about what we need to do and get done. But what's most important is the state of our hearts. Can I offer up some just advice based on this principle? When you think about life, before making any change, before taking big steps, before moving to another stage, before making any big decision, before making major choices, always spend time renewing your relationship with God in your heart. Always try to face what's coming next. Always try to handle what you're going through right now from a good place in your heart. I've seen many times when people, they react. Or something's not good, something's negative, they're angry, they're upset, they're bitter, and then they make a choice in that negative state. It is never good when you do that. It is never good for others when you do that. But what God is most concerned about is the condition and the state of your heart. He's not concerned with what you do in your life as much as why you do it. He's concerned about the state of your heart. So as we learn from this passage, thinking about what's coming next in our life, first we see the Israelites here being circumcised. It was a reminder of their covenant relationship with God. And secondly, what we see here is that their reliance is on God's provision. We'll talk about this. Look at verse 10. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, evening, on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased that day after they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. Now it's interesting here because these verses are very specific about how Israel kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, and it goes into detail to describe that. Now, I'm not going to go into too much specifics here, but just know that it seems like the author is showing a distinct parallel between this Passover in this passage and the first Passover when they crossed the Red Sea after leaving Egypt. Same time in the month that they did that. So just as the first Passover marked them leaving slavery into this era of wandering in the wilderness, this Passover marks the ending of the wandering in the wilderness and now their life in the promised land beginning. So it was transitional points in the history of Israel. Now Passover, of course, is how the Israelites were to forever remember God's freeing them from slavery. Remember in Exodus when Moses is confronting Pharaoh, "Free my people, let them go." what happens is God sends 10 different plagues down upon Egypt to demonstrate his power. And so Passover is remembering how those plagues were coming, and that 10th plague was that death would come to every firstborn son in the nation. And so the spirit of death comes by, and then that night, if there's blood smeared on the doorpost, then that son in that house would be spared, and the spirit of death would pass over that house. And so God commanded that they would always remember and commemorate the Passover and how God would free the people from slavery in Egypt. So people left Egypt. Now for 40 years, God has been feeding them. He's provided food for them through what was called manna. So these Israelites, as they're wandering in the wilderness, every morning manna would appear in the ground. Manna would be collected, this food. It would be collected in baskets, and they would eat of it every day, and God was providing for them. They weren't supposed to keep it overnight. It would spoil if they did, and in the morning, new manna would be provided. It was literally daily bread every day that God was providing for them. Now, interestingly, when they celebrate that first Passover after leaving Egypt, manna comes. Now, when they celebrate this Passover, leaving the wilderness, the manna ceases and the manna stops because a new era for them is beginning. Now, is God not providing for them anymore like he's done for the past 40 years as they wandered in the wilderness? What does manna stopping mean for Israel? Well, it means God is now providing for them in a different way. Before, they don't need to do anything. They just wake up and collect the manna. But now in the promised land, there's no more manna coming, but now they have a homeland. Now they can plant. Now they can produce a harvest from the soil of the land that God has provided for them. Remember, these Israelites, this is a generation that was born in the wilderness. They never planted a seed. They wandered around and every day collected manna that God provided. They were spoon-fed by the hand of God. But now, as they move into this new era, God is not providing for them in that way, but God has given them the land for them to harvest. Now, instead of being spoon-fed like children, God is saying, you must produce. You must be able to feed one another. You must be able to feed others like parents. God is helping them to grow up and use the provision of the land to produce food. I think this growth that's taking place from receiving manna like spiritual children to producing like parents is something that we go through spiritually as well. You know, sometimes we are like children. We receive manna. Sometimes there are seasons when it's almost like you walk into church and you just feel God just with you and blessing you. And when you sing, you just feel like you're in the presence of God. When you do your quiet time, it seems like God is speaking to you and everything was written just for you and God is working powerfully. It's like when you're a child, you're growing up in your family and the food is there on the dinner table and all you have to do is open your mouth. We have spiritual seasons like that. You just feel like everything is coming through sermons and Bible studies in your quiet time. But there are other times when it's harder. You pray, seems like nothing's there. You fight for blessings, and it seems like brick wall is in front of you. It seems like God is so distant and away from you, and you feel like God has forgotten about you. But there may be times like that when God is teaching you to do the hard work of feeding yourself so that you can grow. It's like a helpless baby is really cute. And everybody wants to help that baby, feed it, give it snacks. But 20 years later, if that baby still cannot feed itself, it looks pretty ugly. Something's wrong. Same thing with our hearts. God wants us to be like children, but God also wants to grow us to be like parents. And so not only being like children, but we must also produce food as parents. So during those times when you feel spiritually dry, you got to learn to fight to feed yourself spiritually. You got to learn to dig into the passages of Scripture to study it deeper, to meditate, to examine your heart deeper. You might feel times of being tired of serving or caring or loving others, but just like parents, you grow and you become stronger as you keep trying and keep fighting your heart to love even when you don't feel like loving. That's parenting. If you have to farm the land, it takes a long time before you can see anything grow. But every drop of sweat and every tear was necessary for one single plant to grow. So also remember here, these two modes of being like children and being like parents, they're not just chronological or linear. We go back and forth. Sometimes we need to be fed. Sometimes we need to have others encouraging us and blessing us, but sometimes we need to feed others and be the one that digs deep for others. It shows that we need each other. We need the Word of God together as a family. Sometimes God provides like manna, but sometimes God provides the land for us to labor and to harvest. So whenever we're getting ready for what's next in our journey, in our life, we must make sure that we are learning to eat the provision that God has given to us. Sometimes you may feel childlike joy as God blesses and reveals the truth of His Word to you. But there are times when you must fight for every blessing because He wants to make your heart stronger as you fight for it. So learn to feed yourself spiritually in whatever season you'll face. Then you'll be able to face what's coming next. And you'll be able to feed others in those seasons as well. I just say, it's not in my notes, I didn't say this at earlier service, but I really believe that at this stage in many of our life here, most of you are younger than me, I think, but at this stage, this is a time when being busy and giving all of yourself to whatever you do is good. Because sometimes what happens is you get older and your heart didn't grow in capacity to love and to serve. And when you're younger, you got to do that, and you got to be stretched. You got to be tired, and you got to be a little bit pushed, and you got to get to the edge of sometimes maybe even like close to burnout. You don't want to go there, but close to that, because in those times, you got to fight for blessing. And in those times, you got to learn to pray and cry out to God, strengthen me, help me, I need you. Because what happens is when you get older, if you didn't learn to do that, and you have more responsibilities and more things going on in your life, you can't. You don't know how. And so when you're younger, it's a time to be stretched and serve as much as you can and love people as much as you can. Fill your schedule and be stretched in your capacity, because then when you're older, it's easier to do those things. Then you can produce for others. But many times people become like parents and they're still like children. And it's hard. And so I don't know why I felt like saying that, but just side comment. Okay, so first, we talked about renewal of this covenant. God cares most about the state of our hearts. Second, we talked about relying on His provision. There's times when we have to rely on His daily grace. There's times when I don't feel like doing ministry. There's times when I don't feel like preaching. But I've learned that even in those times when my heart does not feel like it, that through my conviction and through the truth and through what I remember, what I know about God, I can fight for it. And I can bring my heart to that place where even though I don't feel like it, I can start feeling like it because of my conviction that leads my feelings. And we need to learn to do that. Provision of God's blessing is there for us, but you got to learn to fight for it. You got to learn to receive it. You got to learn to dig for it in your heart. Ooh, all this stuff, extra stuff, sorry. And then finally, we'll talk about being ready for the battle. Being ready for the battle. Look at verse 13. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked. And behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us, for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now, can you imagine? Joshua here is the leader of all of Israel. Joshua is like the parent. So during this time, as they're about to face the fortified city of Jericho, this angelic figure appears to Joshua with a drawn sword. Now we see Joshua's reaction. He bows down in worship. So we can conclude that this was not just an angel, but this was what we call a theophany, appearance of God being present with him there. So Joshua is taking off his sandals because he's worshiping God. Just like Moses worshiped at the burning bush, Joshua is taking off his sandals because this place, because God is there, this is holy ground. Whenever we're in the presence of God, that place becomes holy ground. Whenever you meet God in your quiet time, whenever you go to family group and you're worshiping together, studying the Bible, whenever you're talking with someone, fellowshipping together, sharing prayer requests, whenever you're here at church on a Sunday, that place where God is present is holy ground. Always remember that in your worship. Always remember that idea of God's presence that is there with you. So here Joshua says in verse 13, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" Basically, he's asking God here, hey, are you on my side or are you on their side? Because they're about to go to war with Jericho. Now, God doesn't answer the question, but instead, he says, "I'm the commander of the army of the Lord." Basically, God is implying to Joshua that the issue is not whether or not God is on your side, but the issue is whether you are on my side. I'm the commander of the army of the Lord. I'm not here to be one of your guys. I'm the commander of the army of the Lord. I'm going into battle. The question is, are you on my side? Are you with me? So God is saying, if you are on my side, if you align your life to live out my plan, my presence is going to go with you. Isn't that what Jesus says to his disciples in the Great Commission? If you're on my side, living out the Great Commission, my presence will be with you to the very end of the age. Not if you're going to go live out your own Great Commission, but if you live out my Great Commission, my presence is with you to the end of the age. And so the question this morning is, whose side are you on? Are you trying to get God to be on your side, your plans, your agenda in life, your dreams? Or are you trying to be on God's side? There's a big difference. God is never present to make our plans go right. He is present because his redemptive plan is going forward, and we are invited to be part of his plan. So when we think about our life and our journey, getting ready for what's next, we must ask him to use us as his servant, like Joshua did, rather than asking him to be like a genie in a bottle to help us. Many times we pray and it's like you're rubbing the lamp and you're hoping a genie pops out, that's God, and he blesses you and does whatever you want. That's asking God to be on your side. But when we surrender to him, when we say, God, here's a blank sheet of paper, not all this stuff that I wrote here, I want you to do it for me, not an agenda, a list for you to do, check off, but I give you a blank piece of paper and I surrender myself. You show me, you tell me what you want me to do. Then we're surrendering to him. We say, God, I'm on your side. I'm on your side. God's presence was with Moses' generation. God is promising Joshua that his presence will be with his generation as they do his will, God's will. So how do we get ready for the next battle? How do we get ready for what's coming next? We must encounter his presence, fall before him in worship. We must make sure that we're fighting his battle and that we're on his side and living for what his purpose is in our generation. We must be on his side. So as we think about this passage, it's all about getting ready for what's coming next. We talked about renewing the covenant relationship we have with God. We talked about relying on the provision that God gives to us. We talked about being ready by being on His side for the battle that lies ahead. You know, I was thinking sometimes you might be in a place where you say, I want to do this. I want to give my heart to God. I want to follow Him. I want to be on His side. But sometimes you might feel like, I don't think God would accept me anymore. Sometimes you think, because of what I did back then, because of what I did yesterday, 12 years ago, I don't think God can use me anymore. I just feel too dirty or unusable or unlovable in God's eyes. I want to take you back to an illustration I've used before. Many pastors use this illustration, but I thought about this week and it helped me. I thought about, here's some money, right? And I was hoping to use a $100 bill, but I didn't have one. So this is a $20 bill. Okay? Now, let's just pretend it's a $100 bill. If you have one and want to trade for the sake of illustration, go ahead, come up. Let's say this is a $100 bill. If I walk around and I offer this to any of you, I'm pretty sure you would take it, right? Because it's a $100 bill. But think about this bill and where this bill may have traveled and what it's been used for. This $100 bill may have been used to buy food. This $100 bill may have been used to buy someone who's hungry food and help someone, pay someone's medical bills. This $100 bill may have been used to buy drugs. It may have been used to pay for someone to be killed. It may have been used to pay for a prostitute. This bill may have traveled all around the world doing those things. This bill could be wrinkled and dirty. Could go outside and throw this in the mud and pick it up, wrinkled and so filthy and so dirty. But you know what? After all that, even if I were to tear a little piece and put some Scotch tape on it, after all that, how much is this bill worth? It's still worth $100. Why? Because there's a promise on this bill. The promise that's written on this bill gives this bill intrinsic value and intrinsic worth. When God looks at us, because He has redeemed us and He has called us His own, His Hesed covenant love is upon us, we have intrinsic value and intrinsic worth. No matter where we've been, no matter how crumbled up we are, no matter how ripped up and muddy and dirty we are, no matter where and what this has been used for in the past or been used, there's intrinsic value because God says so. And so as we think about what's next in our life, we need to remember God's love for us that redeems us and calls us His own. We are never earning back His love, but rather we are remembering and we're realizing His love that has been declared and never lets us go. So it's God that provides for us, God that leads us to overcome the next Jerichos in our life. I don't know what's coming in your life next, but whatever it is, I hope in your heart you'll renew your walk and relationship with Him. You'll learn to rely on His promises, His provision through His word, and you'll ready yourself for the battle that lies ahead by being on His side. When we're with Him, we cannot fail. We cannot overcome. We will always be victorious. Let's pray together.